welcome to our 129th online gathering for congregational leaders across the country. This weekly gathering is called Courageous Leadership, and it's sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I am Jill Beverland. My pronouns are she, her. I am the program manager for this ministry and one of your facilitators today. As part of my traditional land acknowledgement, I would like you to know that my home is located on the Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. This area is the ancestral territory of 5 nations of Native Indigenous peoples: the Menominee tribe, the Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribe, the Potawatomi tribe, the Oneida tribe, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans and the Brothertown community. I honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which I live. As we step into our time today, friends, I also encourage us to remember we are creating and holding a safe and brave space in these gatherings for you to bring the truth of who you are and how you are doing. These conversations are meant to be an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. So we are, for sure, in for a treat today, friends. We are so blessed to have the Reverend James Henricks with us. James currently serves as the Director for Evangelical Mission in the South Carolina Synod. Prior to entering ministry, James received his Master's of Divinity from Helsinki's Religion, Conflict, and Dialogue program. He has since participated in seminars focusing on conflict management and resolution with the Lutheran World Federation, culminating in contributing to the publication of Blessed Are the Peacemakers. He and his wife have fostered 10 children through LIRS and Lutheran Services of the Carolinas, transitional foster care for unaccompanied minors. In addition, he serves his local community as a volunteer firefighter and a chaplain in Friendly Fire Department and the City of Newberry Fire Department. James, what an interesting life. And these experiences surely have fueled your learning around conflict. And we can't wait to learn from you. Thank you for being with us today and welcome to our space.
Well, thank you all for having me and for the invitation. I'll apologize if I'm coughing or get a little hoarse. I am still on getting over a little bit of COVID, which I'm sure many of you can relate to. So glad to be here with you all virtually and not in person, but I'm feeling mostly normal, but I will probably still take a good nap after this. But anyways, glad to be here with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I believe I've got devotions as well. So let's see. Oop, there we go. So here's a reading that I've got from Corinthians, and I'm going to read it for us here to get started. Paul writes, "Look at what is before your eyes. If you are confident that you belong to Christ, remind yourself of this, that just as you belong to Christ, so also do we. Now, even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem as though I am trying to frighten you with my letters. For someone says his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we will do also when present." I always think it's interesting that in 2 Corinthians, we have Paul who's writing to a community in conflict, and it's the same community that he wrote that thing that was probably read at probably half of our weddings in the room: love is patient, love is kind. Turns out this Corinthians and Paul, by his own admission here, may not always be so patient and or kind. But as a way to think about conflict and as a starting point to ground ourselves, there are a few things here that I think are really interesting as Paul is talking from the middle of a conflict. First is the reminder that I think if we're all really honest with ourselves, when we get really angry or we're in that conflict that's really kind of touching a nerve with us, that the sentence that Paul writes, that just as you belong to Christ, so also do we, tends to turn more in our minds to, well, we belong to Christ. but maybe we need to remember that you do as well. So it's always being able to see the Christ and the other in conflict here. I think it's one powerful takeaway. The second here is that the authority that Paul has, and, looking around the Zoom screen, I know there's plenty of us who have, positions of our own authority or in positions of power, even just as pastors or lay leaders of a church. The authority that we do have is for building up and not for tearing down. And that, again, thinking of conflict, another powerful thing for me. And then especially important, I find on social media is this, what Paul says about his letters. Being the same person we are when absent, or in modern language, being the same person online as we are when we are in person. So again, I am not Paul, but as we all seek to emulate somebody who was called by the Holy Spirit to the ministry and did such a powerful job with it, I hope that this is a good framing and a starting point for what we can do today. So we join our hearts in prayer. Gracious Lord, we give you thanks for the gift of your presence, because it is in the context of conflict that your presence, where two or three are gathered, your presence is with us. We ask that you be with us in this time, that your Spirit may be among our discussions, our conversations, and that way we may leave here better equipped and empowered to serve your kingdom through all kinds of change and conflict and hard conversations. We ask all of this in your most holy name. Amen. Okay, so just as a way of framing how we want to talk about conflict, there's just a way to talk about conflict in the abstract. But as an exercise in a case study, this is the hypothetical I want us to see ourselves in, or to have in the back of our mind. So let's jump in our time machine and go back to the wonderful time that it was to be in the summer of 2020. And because right throughout the church, everybody was having conversations about what to do. And so let's imagine that we have a pastor who in their own life has health concerns and is personally very worried about contracting a severe illness. And because of that, the pastor's been working with the congregation to lead online worship services for the last several months. Now let's imagine too, we've got a council president who's, let's say, is older, doesn't do online worship well, has a very hard time with technology, and in council meetings is pushing very hard to get back into person. Chances are this is a dynamic that's built up, and at this point in 2020 has just kind of repeated, and it feels like a gridlock. The pastor's probably thinking or saying things to the extent of, they don't care about my safety. And the president's probably telling anybody who will listen to him or her, we need to get back into the pews. So we can all probably, if we don't recognize that, we can all probably at least empathize it. So what I hope we can do today is, with that in mind, in a situation like this, in the challenges like this, how do we understand where we are, but then how do we, with that understanding, take steps to move out of a conflict like this, or to make this kind of conflict more productive? And so to do that, I'm bringing a tool. This is called the Thomas Kilmann Index, named after the people who actually came up with it, so it is not me. And it is a graph. So you'll see here on our x-axis, the horizontal line, that's the importance of the relationship, because in conflict, we have those relationships we need to manage, but then also the vertical line is the importance of the issue. So let's look at our first quadrant here. And so when the relationship is not very important and the issue is not important, the dominant strategy here is to actually avoid conflict. I know people say you shouldn't avoid it, but the example I typically use when I'm doing presentations for this is to say, let's say I'm driving down the highway and somebody thinks I'm driving too slow and drives past me, giving me the one finger salute. I don't know them. I don't want to know them. I don't need that relationship in my life. And whatever has irritated them, I have already forgotten about. It's proper to avoid, right? Or let's say I'm walking my dog at night, somebody's walking down the street and they look drunk. I'm going to cross the street, right? There's all of these times where it is actually appropriate to avoid. But the interesting thing to remember is that because of this, conflict, when we're in it, is a consequence of our need for one another. Because if I don't need you and if you don't need me, we don't have a problem. I think we forget that online a lot, right? Because, we just want to dunk on somebody on Twitter or whatever it is. And, whereas we don't have a relationship and the issue may not be important to us. So anyways, that's this bottom left quadrant here. And then moving upwards, when the relationship, and I shouldn't say isn't important, but maybe less important than the issue, the strategy here is control. A healthy example of this typically would be in situations where health or safety are at work. So, for example, if there's a child running towards the road, I'm going to grab him and I'm going to pull him back. I'm not going to stop and say, hey, you shouldn't do that, and then get into a 5-minute discussion, right? Or in a healthy church context, this looks like the person with 2 DUIs doesn't get to drive the youth van. It's the policies that protect the ministry, and unfortunately, it may damage the relationship and it may cause some harm to that. But at the end of the day, the issue would be the overriding concern there. So that's what control can look. Well, and in an unhealthy way, it basically looks like any council vote that's 50% plus one, or the politicking, or the attempt to try and have a vision and get just enough majority to get the outcome that you want. So that's what control can look like. Then we get compromise. And this one is really a compromise of them all, in that it does a mediocre job of addressing the relationship issues, and it does a moderate job of addressing the issue. It's a really good quick fix. It is not a good long-term solution. Everybody tends to walk away happy. So best used for, let's say it's Sunday morning and you and your organist are having a discussion about how something needs to look in worship. You might in the moment say, hey, how about just for today, let's, and then you split the difference, whatever that looks like, and then say, but we can have a conversation on Wednesday about what this can look like in the future. So typically good when you need that quick fix that kind of works or kind of doesn't work for everybody. And then we get over here to where the relationship is important and the issue may not be important to you. Anybody on this call who is married or in a relationship can probably relate to this one. When we got married, my wife folded her clothes one way, I folded them another. I don't care how I fold my clothes, so now I fold my clothes another way. It's truly nothing to me, and it makes my wife happier. So, win-win all around, right? In ministry, an example of this that I use is when I was in the parish, I started a young adults group. Excuse me. But then I wanted to get it started and then hand it off to somebody. So we had the first event at our house, had the young adults of the congregation over, and then I kind of passed it off. And it ended up looking a lot different than maybe I would have imagined it being myself. But the relationship was important. The people were getting together. And even though it didn't necessarily look like I might have liked it to, the more important thing was that the people were getting together and lifting one another up in prayer. And then we get to the top right quadrant, which is where we would all ideally like to live most of the time, I hope. And this is collaboration. So when the relationship is important, you're working with somebody to help them solve not only your issue, but their issue as well. Maintaining and protecting the relationship while working together to address the issue. We're going to talk more about collaboration, but while I've got them all on the screen here, what I want to point out is that each of these are valid strategies. So at any given point, it may be appropriate to avoid conflict, despite whatever advice we get along the way to not avoid conflict. Control may not be in our nature, or may be too much in our nature, but in times of health or safety may be appropriate. When we get into trouble is when we try and use the wrong strategy for when we're in the wrong quadrant. So if something is important to me And if an issue is important to me and the relationship is important, but if all I do is accommodate, all I'm going to do is become slowly more and more bitter over time. Or if I'm avoiding instead of controlling, that damages the relationship and does not solve the needs. So like going back to the DUI issue, if all I'm doing is just ignoring the phone calls and emails from the person who says, hey, I would really like to volunteer and drive the youth bus, and I know they've got 2 DUIs, by just not returning the phone calls or returning the emails or having the hard conversation, I'm damaging the relationship even further, while at the same time just avoiding the issue that is inevitably going to come up. So yeah, we ended up, excuse me, we end up in trouble when we try and use the wrong strategy in the wrong quadrant. So let's go back to our hypothetical, right? We've got this pastor who is walking around. They don't care about my safety. A president saying, we need to get back in the pews. I can actually make the argument that control is the strategy, or that collaboration is the strategy. And right, this is all contextual too. But certainly avoiding or accommodating probably isn't, because for everybody involved, the issue is important. And, you know, while I can make an argument for control, I would say the relationship with the council president, or the relationship between council president and pastor, would warrant at least an effort at collaboration. Now, when we get to this, what we end up hearing is a story that's also probably familiar, because we have a pastor who says, they don't care about my safety, but I'm not going to budge because I care about my safety. And then we have a council president who says, this online stuff isn't cutting it for me. We need to get back in the pews. And when we phrase it like that, we feel like we're just locked in, right? We have the same argument over and over and over again, and it goes absolutely nowhere. So how do we get around that? So this is just a quick slide, and I could probably talk for more hours than I have time about this. But one of the biggest pieces of advice I give to people is to solve the same problem. Because if we go back to our example here, the pastor, what is this pastor's problem? I have a health concern. The president, I want a more meaningful worship experience. What we're doing is it's no wonder that the pastor who's looking at themselves and solving problems for themselves reaches the conclusion we need to continue worship online. And it's no wonder that the council president, from their own values, situations, and needs, answering their own question leads to a different response. And then what happens is we get so locked into these responses that we've set up for ourselves, we get locked into these positions that we just end up battling back and forth. So the way around that is to focus on the values and needs instead of positions. Because instead of the pastor saying, I'm sorry, we're continuing online worship, the pastor, what the values and the needs are behind that are safety. It's care for not only the pastor and his or herself, but the whole congregation, because we're the ELCA. So we have an elderly denomination for the most part. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm going to blame that one on COVID. But then we've got, those are the values there, right? That's the pastor. If we really dug beyond it, that's what we would hear, is we would hear of the values and the needs for safety, both personal and for the rest of the congregation. If we really listen to the congregation member, and we all know that congregation members always express this in healthy and positive ways, but we would know that if we really dug deep and were empathetic and listened to that, we would probably understand them to say, I want a more meaningful worship experience on Sunday morning. And I can relate to that. Like, I can understand that. That is not a bad value to have. So once you get into the values, it really doesn't become about right and wrong anymore. And they become irrelevant, because the pastor and his or her desire to keep everybody safe, that's a value I can get behind. The congregation members' value of a meaningful worship experience, I could say the same for that. And then we get to the how do we solve the same problem? And so I've given a few examples here, but what has worked for me is, excuse me, is if I'm able to really listen, and this takes a lot of work because we have to get out of our lizard brain into the frontal, the higher order thinking part of our brain. But if we can really, kind of suspend our judgment and do all of those things they teach us to do in CPE, or to just really listen to understand and listen to empathize, we're going to be able to hear the values that are behind there. So then it helps us to name a question that everybody can get behind. And what I like to do is I'll say, so it sounds like the question we're trying to answer is, and in that way, if it's wrong, people will tell you it's wrong. And then you can back up and you can try again. So in the scenario that when we were talking about today, so the pastor or the leader might say, so it sounds like our question is, how do we keep everybody safe while having a more meaningful worship experience? Now, the pastor hears his or her concerns reflected in the question. The council president hears his values, what he's concerned about, or he or she is concerned about in the question. And so then that gets them actually working together instead of just butting heads, in theory, right? Perfect world. But and the important thing is that everybody can see themselves in the answer then as well. And it gets us out of the only way to do this is online worship. The only way to do this is worship in the pews. I mean, there's 100 different possibilities to how do we keep people safe while having a more meaningful worship experience. And with hindsight, we could say that could look like everybody's masked. It could look like communion services of 10 people or fewer. It could look like a parking lot worship service. It could look like better production from our online worship, right? And this is where the people in it have to solve it for themselves, because very rarely is there one and only one answer. But what's going to work is the answer that works for everybody who's involved. So again, some different ways you can phrase it. How do we balance the need for safety with the desire for more meaningful worship? How do we meet the needs for more meaningful worship while keeping everybody safe? There's a different ways to phrase this, but again, what I like to do is I throw it out there as, so it sounds like our question is, and then name it, because as soon as they buy in and say, yes, exactly, that's what we're working on together, that's when we unlock from the positions, working from our values, and are able to move forward in a little bit more productive direction. So I went through a lot of information really quick, but I do have some discussion questions for the group. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any before we go. But the questions I had or thought that might be helpful for you all in the small groups is, which of these strategies comes most naturally to you? Which of the strategies is hardest for you to step into? And is there a conflict that you've had or are having that this brings new clarity or insight to? And Jill and Jason, I don't know if you usually take questions a little bit before, or if we want to do that after, or what works for you all.
We are on a good spot on the clock. And so I would say that if you have any immediate questions that might help prepare you as you go into small group time, let's take a couple of minutes to ask James.
I just want to reflect back on the quadrant. On those 4 points in the quadrant again, what were they?
I will share my screen again here real quick. So avoid, control, collaborate, accommodate, and then compromise right in the middle.
And James, will any of this material be available in PDF form for us to post alongside of the recording?
Yeah, I'm happy to get that to you.
Perfect. Thank you. That's always very helpful. Many people, many leaders access these recordings and use them as teaching tools. Persida, I saw you raise your hand, friend. And you're muted too, by the way.
Sorry about that. The word when you put compromise in the middle, does that's good, right? That's a good place to be, or no?
Yes and no. So compromise is best when you just kind of need that quick, all right, let's make a decision and move on, right? It's very rarely the best long-term solution, because if you get a when you compromise, it just means everybody's given up a little bit of what they want, rather than everybody has gotten all of their needs met. And sometimes that may be the best you can do, but typically you can have a better outcome if you're willing to take the extra time to kind of move into that collaboration portion.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Great question.
None of these are bad strategies. It's just making sure that you're using them for the appropriate reasons.
Yeah.
Sure. Charlie, how about you?
Yeah, so I have found that it's difficult sometimes to get people to agree on what the problem is. So what strategies do you have for helping people come to an agreement? And I'm thinking sometimes when I've worked with couples who are in conflict, to get them to agree on what the problem is, even when I say, so what do you hear the other person say, and how would we objectify this? You're not the problem, the other's not the problem. What's the real problem here? How do you help people get to that?
Yeah, again, I think listening for the values is really important there. The other, and this is maybe beyond what I was presenting today, but people generally talk about in terms of emotion. So like, I am angry or I am furious. Perception, you don't care about me, or action, you didn't take out the garbage, or whatever it is for couples, right? And typically how people are talking about it, or what they're saying, is how they're experiencing it themselves. So to be able to say, if this person is experiencing, I am angry. So just to be able to maybe to name that and recognize that for different people, maybe processing that differently, might be another step to take too. If you, are trying to do the values, play the values game or that formula, and that's just still not working for you, that would be another step.
James, I have a question regarding what's the work solving the problem together and listening for the same values. I've had more than one conversation with a leader in ministry who they try a collaborative approach, especially in regards to this issue, and the response that they get is, well, deacon or pastor, I care about you. This COVID, it's no big deal. And, God wouldn't let you, essentially some effect of God wouldn't let you get sick, or something along those lines. So it's not even the same value. I mean, it is, they're not even the same vegetable. Like one's a fruit and one's a carbohydrate kind of thing.
I don't think they even need to necessarily be the same values, if that makes sense. So like in the past, the example I was using, like, well, and I'll be honest, I'm drawing a little bit from experience too, my own COVID, in the parish experience with that. The values or needs don't even have to be the same. You just have to acknowledge them and work to have both values met. And and I know that it's often much messier than my formula makes it out to be, right? But what for me, when I was in, seminary and we were doing all of these, or taking preaching classes, we were using one of Tom Long's books, and it had like 20 different exercises in it. I'm like, why am I ever going to need these exercises? And then I get into the parish and have to preach every week and realize, oh, they're not for the week that, I have my idea after 10 minutes. They're for the week where it's Thursday. I've been staring at it since Monday and I still don't know where I'm going. That's kind of how I see what what I presented, right? It's for the, when we get so locked into conflict and I don't know what to do, okay, let's step back. What is important to this person? How do we have their needs met? And do I actually care about solving their problem as well as mine? And, you know, unfortunately too, when it comes to health and safety, if collaboration doesn't work, unfortunately, the option is then control. And that unfortunately does have negative consequences, but that is the next play. So
It strikes me. Oh, sorry, Jill.
No, you go.
This is Carol. It strikes me. I spent a decade as a dispute mediator, and I love what you're saying because it fits the model that I use beautifully. One of the key elements, though, to a successful mediation was the parties had to be at a point where the pain of staying where they are is greater than the pain of making some sort of change. Until they get there, there's not going to be much movement.
yeah, everybody has to want it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another way of saying that I've heard is there's two things people hate: change and the way things are. And until the idea of change is worse than the way things are, yeah, things tend to not move.
So friends, we've had some great clarifying discussion. So now is the time for us to move to our breakout rooms and continue that discussion. I'll be anxious to hear what else bubbles up and what learnings surface for you when we come back to the large room. Let's come back at about 5 till the hour, okay? And God bless your conversations. James, thank you for a great sharing. Welcome back to this space, friends. Hope that you had inspired conversation. And so for the next few minutes, I would love to hear what bubbled up for you while you were talking with your small group buddies, or what are some learnings that surfaced for you? Please feel free to unmute and share, or raise your hand if you'd like.
We had great conversation. A lot of people who had some real experience over time with handling and managing conflicts. We started out talking a little bit about how we, as kids, grew up and what did we learn about conflict? Was it good, positive, negative? Do we do it? Do we not? How do we do it? And a couple takeaways, I think, from our conversation is, James, your model is really good, and there are other ones out there like this that give us a way to reflect on how we hold relationship, how we see the issues. Is consensus the same as collaboration? Is it different? The idea of maybe getting people into some different space so that whatever the pace is, that you might slow the pace down of the conflict so that people can actually hear each other in the roar of what's going on, or maybe speeding it up and saying, let's get this resolved and off our plates. And then the other question that we were talking about at the end that I want to share here, and the group can certainly add anything to it, but we think compromise many times is such a rich and useful tool. Short term, is that the same if we look out long term? And maybe it isn't a win-win solution long term. And so maybe to add some criteria in the moment when the conversation goes and you're coming to solution, that it's one that'll work today, but also down the road. And then a quote at the end was, can't breathe in and out at the same time. You got to choose. Thanks, team. Anything else that anybody wants to add?
It sounds like very rich conversation, Janice. Thank you so much for sharing. How about from another small group? So a different question, since I'm a coach, I have to bring these questions to the table, right? What's one tool that you're taking away from this conversation today, that the next time you feel conflict rising up in your heart, that radar goes off for you? What's one tool that you're going to engage because you attended this session today? Cindy, please.
Yeah, I think really listening for the values and sort of making sure it's the same problem that we're solving. So we're not talking over or around each other, but really working together for solution.
Exactly. That's golden learning, Cindy, that often the conflict is escalating because we are we're not even talking about the same thing. We have not found that common ground. And while you all were in the small groups, I was speaking with Jason and James, and my sassy example at the beginning, it just made me wonder, how would that conversation have gone differently had, instead of me making the statement, and the recording is on, so it's going to be recorded, your worldview disgusts me. How would that have changed had I said something to the effect, it feels like we're coming at this topic from different worldviews, right? That would have completely lowered the emotional charge in the room and would have presented an opportunity to find those common values. And then to ask those questions, what about your worldview and the worldview that I'm bringing to the table can we put together to find a solution that will help address the topic at hand? But making sure we're talking about the same problem first is important. And with that, the thing that I really love I loved everything that James talked about, but I love that in the end, everybody sees themselves as part of the solution as well. So in the beginning, this formula works at, let's make sure that everyone is heard and everyone understands how they're contributing to it. But in the end, it's so Christ-like because everyone's part of the solution as well. So James, thank you again for this time. It has just been absolutely rich. I assure you that people are going to access this recording as teaching material. So thank you for also sending support documents. Friends, next week, we have with us the individuals that led Reiki and Faith. They're doing a follow-up session with us. So Danielle Groth and Pastor Vicki Lovell will be with us. So we hope to see you again next Wednesday, 1 to 2 p.m. Friends, please know that you are seen, you are valued, and you are loved. Thank you for attending. God bless you. Have a great rest of the week.
God bless you.